Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today we are going to be going through the decks that I worked with in 2020. Now, this is something I wanted to do to reflect on my year, the phases and chapters I've gone through, what did I read, what was I interested in. All of that I feel like can be very well reflected in the decks that I chose to work with. Now, I also have a video that I think is interesting for me to have gone back and watched. It is the decks that I said I wanted to work with in 2020, and I made this at the end of 2019 or the very beginning of 2020, and it was one of my more, I would say, formative YouTube videos, so felt a bit cringy to watch, but it was also interesting to see how I've grown as a communicator and how I've grown in comfort in terms of the camera and speaking extemporaneously. So if you care to watch that, I'll put it in the cards. I personally watched that video to see and go back and wondered about, did I actually kind of follow through with what I said I wanted to do in 2020? I didn't actually make a list. I just spoke to that very much in the moment, and it's funny that a bunch of those things did come to pass, but then there were a few that didn't, and so I might bring up some of that as well, and just speak to why I didn't work with some of the decks that I spoke about in that video. The lighting that we're working with today is not that great. It's very gloomy, so I'm kind of relying upon this artificial lighting. I am also feeling a bit under the weather, so I feel like my voice sounds a bit froggy, and personally, I feel like I look like walking death, but maybe the camera's being kind to me, so just bear with me. But without further ado, we'll get into these. I'm just going to show them rather than flip it over to my tarot table. It's more about my experience with the deck than showing you the deck itself and the cards. I know most of these decks have wonderful walkthroughs out there. Now, without further ado, we'll dive in. I have more decks than I actually expected. I kind of tried to go through and just think to myself if I had a significant period of time with the deck and reading about it. So the first one that will be no surprise is the Thoth deck. Now, this is the one that I think was the most consistent deck that I worked with in 2020, the one that was around pretty much every day for most things that I read the most on throughout the year. I was constantly returning to it, and it kind of never left the focal point of my practice. It was pretty much the sun in which everything else revolved around it. So I don't think that that's a surprise. I think if you watch my videos in general, most of these decks will not come as a surprise, but the Thoth was definitely at the top of the list, and I think I read the most books in connection to the Thoth, and for me that's a big part of working with the deck, is reading books and things surrounding the system or the style or the theme of the deck, and that helps me to get acquainted with it, along with actually doing readings with the deck and trying to understand it, the artwork, the history, and all that went into it, and then to build a relationship for myself based on experience. So Thoth was definitely number one. I won't harp on that one too much. Now, in the same vein of the Thoth deck, one that I know I spoke to in that original video of decks I want to work with in 2020, I did speak to is this the Tabula Mundi Tarot? Yeah, sorry, I wanted to say Anima Mundi, but no, this is the Tabula Mundi Tarot by M.M. Lean. And this is one that I mentioned I wanted to work with and then read the book. I did read the book and I love the book. Let's see, I'm just trying to pull out the cards. I have the astrology cards on the bottom. But this is one that, yes, I did read the book and really enjoyed. Actually, I think I enjoyed the book a little bit more than I enjoyed the deck. To me, I would say it almost borders on being more of an art deck than a functional deck for me. I do readings with this deck on occasion, and I think I ought to use it more, but for some reason or another, I wind up working with the just traditional Thoth a lot more than I worked with this one. So as I was reading the book, actually, that accompanied this, I would try to use the book's messages and meanings in terms of the traditional Thoth as opposed to this deck. I thought it would be more helpful for me in that way, and I knew that M.M. Maline's writing in terms of the Thoth was actually going to be pretty pivotal for me in my Thoth studies. So for some reason or another, this one just didn't make it out as much, but I was working with it, I would say, pretty actively, and it did have its moment in the sun. So for some reason or another, it did actually come to fruition that this was one I wanted to work with this year, that I did work with this year. And I read the book, of course, and really enjoyed that. I think M.M. Maline's writing style is amazing, and that is a Thoth book that I would recommend to any and everyone who wants to get into reading the Thoth. So in keeping with a similar Thothy theme, one that didn't actually enter my radar until I was in the midst of 2020 and more toward the latter end of 2020 is Tarot of the Spirit. So this is one that I did take the time and set a month aside to read the corresponding guidebook, which is on the chunkier side, so it wasn't the easiest read. It's not a quick read, so I did take my time with this, and this is one that I anticipated being an all-star deck, an all-time favorite, and while I do love this deck very dearly and enjoy reading with it, I think I recall mentioning that I didn't really end up liking this deck as much as I thought I would. In theory, it fits and ticks all of the boxes for me, but at the same time, in practice, it just doesn't speak in the way that I would hope it would, and that's just something that I can't quite help. I think that there's some sort of breakthrough that I need to have, or some sort of place I need to reach, and then this deck will kind of open itself up to me. At least that's how I feel. So I don't intend to give up on this deck or pass it on or anything like that. I think it's beautiful, and there is a part of me that loves it very much, but at the same time, I think I just really like the idea of this deck in theory, and then in practice it doesn't measure up. So there's some sort of disconnect in that way. And going back to the decks that I decided or announced that I wanted to work with in 2020, just I guess a caveat. For me personally, the way that I like to work with decks and study them is based on my interests in any given moment. I find that it's really difficult for me to force myself to do something that I don't want to do, so I do allow a lot of flexibility, and while I will sometimes plan things out over time, there's a decent amount of the time when that plan does not come to fruition, when halfway through I change my mind or something new sort of enters my world, and then I decide to shake things up and go in a different direction. So a big thing for me in all the decks that I worked with were that in any given moment, they symbolized something that I needed or wanted or felt called to. And so for me, that is very important and significant. It also speaks to who I am. And so, for example, with Tarot of the Spirit, I think I was looking for something greater and higher. And I know many can resonate with the kind of notion that 2020 was a year that was quite unexpected and strange and hard to expect. And I think that the decks I work with really reflect that. I think that on a year that was a lot more steady and stable, I probably would have followed through with the decks that I kind of had in mind or announced that I wanted to work with in 2020 or in any given year. If the year had maybe gone a little bit smoother, this would have been a lot different. And I think it's fun for me to now look and see what I kind of needed, what decks sort of came into my life and I felt called to work with out of necessity. So Tarot of the Spirit was one of them, and I think there's more to come with that deck, but I'm just not ready for it quite yet. And I do have the book, the even larger book, that speaks to the Kabbalah in terms of Tarot of the Spirit, and I haven't read that one yet, but I have read a few books on the Kabbalah. To me, the Kabbalah as a system, as a lens of viewing the world, as a sort of spiritual paradigm was major for me in 2020, so I do like decks that draw upon the Kabbalah, and of course the Thoth is one of those as well. So the Kabbalah as a system is one that I worked with quite a bit in 2022. So this is a deck that I worked with a lot in 2019, and I think for the beginning part of 2020 it was a pretty big mainstay, and this is the Fox Universe Tarot, a self-care oracle. So it's not a traditional tarot, although it does have 78 cards, or I think it might have a bonus card or two, but it does follow the tarot structure. But I wouldn't say that any of the suits actually match the traditional suits of wands, cups, pentacles, and swords. They kind of have their own thing. And then there are the same amount of majors, there are court cards, so that's about where the similarities end. I do have a review of this deck, and I did a self-care reading that I have posted, I think, on my channel where I use this deck, and for a while I was offering, and I still do, I guess, offer that reading to clients at times. So for me, this one has been major, one with clients, but also with a self-care practice for myself. Personally, I think this one was a surprise for me, even in 2019, because The art style isn't something that I think I naturally jive with or would have sought out, but something about it does grab me. And there's also the idea that it's black and white. I do prefer some colors, and I think I like more abstract style decks. And then the idea of a deck that's very modern and self-care oriented is one that I would have never imagined liking, but nonetheless, it in some way really grabs hold of me, and I do find myself returning to it very often. So for one reason or another, I guess it speaks to a part of me that I'm not as acquainted with or not as familiar with. And so I think there's a lot here for me to uncover in terms of myself and aspects that I might be less familiar with. So the Fox Universe Tarot, a self-care oracle, was a big favorite for me, and I think it's going to continue to be one as well. Now, one that has been a deck in my tarot journey that has been on and off favorite for quite some time is the Tarot of the She. I tend to work with this deck a lot more in the warmer months, so I know this past summer, this was a big one for me, just as it was the summer before, and as it kind of got cooler out, especially during these months, I found myself not using it, not really turning to it as much. And I know that there are many who use this deck seasonally as well. For me, I think I actually did a lot of reading on the She this past summer. I found a lot of books by authors that had their own experiences with the She in terms of channeling or nature spirits in a way. And I think my knowledge and understanding of what the word or term or title She means has expanded quite a bit. I used to just feel like they were, or that the She were basically fairies or the fair folk or the fae, but based on a lot of the readings that I read in working with this deck, I kind of came to view them a bit differently, and so this deck actually makes a lot more sense to me now, and I think it added a layer of depth and nuance in my relationship with the She, and I do feel like I have a sort of connection to them, and I would usually be using this deck outside, so when I would go to parks or walking around the lake or something like that, as this year was kind of that was a necessity. There wasn't much of an option to do other things, so nature was something I think a lot of us turned to when the weather permitted, and I know that this was one that I would throw in my backpack and work with outdoors, and it felt right to do that. And so to me, this deck just reminds me of my time spent in nature, really trying to connect and making concerted efforts to be present in any given moment, and to hopefully shift my perceptions and my reality in a way that was helpful and growth-oriented for me. So I really enjoyed working with Tarot of the She again this year, and I think each year my understanding of this deck grows, and the way that I work with it shifts and changes for the better. So big one for me as always. So next, and this one was a bit unexpected, and this is one that did come into my collection at the end of 2019, but I think a lot of the work I did with it was in 2020, and this is the, is this the right cards? Yes, okay. The Orisoma Tarot. So this is the logo back one, and this is the one I received first. I do have the bottle back version, which I found later in 2020 on Etsy, and this is a deck that for some reason I felt very called to, and so I did purchase it, and it was a pricier purchase, but something about it really, really speaks to me, and I think it's the colors of the deck. Something about it to me feels very energetic and high vibe, and sort of ethereal and beyond. It's not a deck that I would turn to feel grounded or for practical matters. It's the kind of deck I would go to with an emotion that I can't make sense of, or a feeling that is tugging at me about something that I don't quite understand and can't tie to words. And so this deck has been very interesting for me in my explorations of those sorts of things, my intuition and more spiritual side that isn't grounded so much, the side of my spirituality that is a little bit more unexplainable. And then there's also the fact that I would use this a decent amount in client readings. I think in the earlier half of 2020, there was a decent amount of client readings that I was doing with this deck, and I think it performed in such a unique way in the way that messages would come through when I was using it. So strangely enough, this is one that I wouldn't have imagined working with or liking, let alone using for others, but it did happen to work out that way, and I'm very happy that it did. I really enjoyed the guidebook as well, and I did read that really popular Orisoma book that many recommend with this deck. I did read that book as well, and I found that one to be, I think, really comforting in a weird way, although it is a book that teaches more of the system and the correspondences of Orisoma. I think that the system itself is really beautiful, and although I did have some hiccups and bumps in terms of the production and delivery style of this deck, which is its own story, this deck itself was one I think I worked with quite a bit, and it does have a solid chunk of 2020 carved out just for itself, so I had to mention this one. Now, next, and one that I did actually speak to in the decks that I do want to work with in 2020 is or are, let me see, I'm trying to get all these over here. Okay, these are the Robert M. Place decks, the more alchemical ones at least. So we have the Alchemical Tarot. This is the 5th edition, or the Tarot Renewed edition. And I know when I had showed this deck in the decks that I wanted to work with in 2020, I was holding up the 4th edition, but yes, I think I used the 5th edition a bit more. So I did use this one. I think, and I've spoken to the fact that my favorite of the alchemical decks, or my favorite of all Robert M. Place decks, is the Tarot of the Alchemical Magnum Opus. I prefer the more minimal art style of this one. So this is the one that I found that I was drawn to the most in terms of work, for myself, for others, for readings. To me, this just speaks the most clearly, and I'm able to immerse myself the most easily in this deck. It doesn't feel crowded or cluttered, and I don't feel overwhelmed or like I'm reaching for anything when I'm using it. It feels like it's a very effective communicator, in the same way that I would hope that I can then communicate effectively. So yeah, the Tarot of the Alchemical Magnum Opus was probably the favorite, and then I did acquire the Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery. This is the 2nd edition. And so the big thing for me was that I wanted to read the big book that accompanies, or is meant to accompany, the Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery and the Alchemical Tarot. And so I did read that book. I have a review of that book up, so I'll try to remember to link it somewhere. But this is one that I actually really enjoyed and wasn't expecting to enjoy as much as I did or do. And so this one kind of came out of the blue, and there was a time when I thought I just wasn't going to get this. It didn't seem like something that would appeal to me, but I do like that it does have this sort of classical feel, and the minors are a bit less illustrated, I would say, than the Rider-Waite-Smith, but at the same time, they're not strictly or solely pips, or lesser illustrated pips. There is something more to them. These cards do stick together, which is a bit of an annoyance. But aside from that, I think I really enjoy Robert M. Place's clean art style. All of the lines are just neat, and it's something about his art style to me is very satisfying. So I do enjoy that. And him as a writer, there's just a lot there. He adds a lot of depth and puts a lot into the decks that he creates. I personally like when there's a lot of history and meaning and symbolism and something to kind of dive into and understand when, in terms of the artwork or the system of a deck. It's not that, and I know that there is something to be said for those who create decks more intuitively and just based on their imagination or what they think something ought to be, but I do like when creators take the time to pick a certain facet of history or of correspondences or a spiritual paradigm or lens, and then make a deck surrounding that. And so then there's this, I would say, a real level of complexity in terms of study and history to be learned when you take the time to really work with that deck. And so that for me is really important, and it's something that Robert M. Place does so well. He's, in my mind, as much a historian as he is, or a historical scholar of some sort, as he is a tarot creator. And so for me, that's part of my draw to him and why I feel so, I would say, at home and interested in his creations. So next we have one that actually didn't really enter my life until 2020, so there wasn't a way for me to have anticipated that I would want to work with this deck, but it's one that I've spoken about quite a bit, and that is the Masonic Symbolic Tarot. This is the guidebook. It has a chunkier little white book. This is a deck that is out of print, unfortunately, but I know that sometimes you can find them on eBay and Etsy. It's in French as well as English, and this is based on Freemasonry and those concepts. It is a pip style deck. The majors are extremely elaborate and intricate, and there is this sort of gold reflective quality throughout the deck. As far as pip decks go, I think this would have to be my favorite, although the Thoth to some is a pip deck. I don't consider it a pip deck, so that's just that. But for me, this is a pip deck, but a wonderfully well done pip deck, and in a way that really works for me. I don't feel very called to Marseille style at all, and I think that the way those pips are done it doesn't really grab me as much. I don't find myself able to maintain a level of interest, and so the reading doesn't really serve as much of a purpose. It doesn't get to the level I need it to. But with these pips, there is enough going on, I would say, for me to feel like it's simple, but at the same time nuanced and complex. So all of the borders change for all of the pips. You can see that we have like the 3 discs, but they make a triangle, and there's the little, each one almost has its own triangle, and then we have the symbol for sulfur. We get a sun and a moon. It's just very interesting. Some of the cups have hands, red and green hands in them, and then all of the borders are going to be different for each one, which I find very interesting. And then the cups, all of the cups are different. The quartz are beautiful, but yeah, I really, really like the way the pips are done because each one is so different. The border design changes. There'll be these little flourishes that are kind of implemented, and you really have to look for them. So I feel like I am almost viewing a print or a painting, and I'm looking at the line work. And of course, with Freemasonry, angle and line and the construction of something, the way it's done is very, very important. And so I think the attention to detail here is very much, it stems from and is connected to ideas of and held within Freemasonry. Although I would say I don't know much about Freemasonry at all. I do intend to learn a bit, but I would say that that's not a secret society or area of knowledge that I'm as interested in. So we will see. But this deck for me was a mainstay, continues to be one, and it's one of my favorite decks of all time now. So that's that. Okay, so last but certainly not least, this deck is, I'm not sure if I included any Oracle really. I would say I'm not a big Oracle user. I look for decks that have a system, and so for me, Tarot is usually it. But in and toward the end of 2020, I've been quite interested in playing card divination and more, I would say, traditional elements and styles of cartomancy. So the one that I've been using the most is Anna Cortez's playing card Oracle divination deck, I believe is the full title. I do have a review recently posted of this deck along with the alchemical edition of this deck, but this is the standard or original version, and I have been loving playing card divination. I think it's a system that I overlooked. I personally am not as interested in Lenormand or Kipper because I feel like there are too few amounts of cards, and I know that, for example, Lenormand is much more about fortune telling and forecasting, and each card is very almost blunt and has such a distinctive meaning that I didn't feel like there was enough room to kind of wiggle and grow and do my own thing with. But with playing cards as a whole deck, I do feel like I can use this in a similar way to tarot. I can sort of transpose correspondences onto them, and the structuring and ordering of the deck to me makes a lot of practical sense. And so I've been loving playing card divination for more practical matters, and it really has my interest at this given moment. I do have and work with more traditional style playing cards. One that I really love is the Pagan playing cards by Usi. So this is a great one that just has more, I would say, traditional pips. So they're not as illustrated, whereas Anna Cortez's playing card decks do have illustrated minors and pips, whereas most playing cards wouldn't. But I enjoy both actually, and I don't mind the lesser illustrated pips of playing cards, which is interesting because I don't really like Marseille and the way that that's illustrated, but I do enjoy lesser illustrated playing card pips. So go figure with that. But I have really been enjoying that system, and through that system I've been then introduced to geomancy, which I've been reading up on quite a bit. And while that's not a deck per se that I've worked with in 2020, it is a system of correspondence or its own system of divination that I have been learning and actively engaging in, so more to come on that. But I think this is the only deck that's really, really far outside of the tarot zone that I've been working with, but I'm very excited to go further with the idea of playing card decks and divination in that way. So I think that takes us through all of the decks that really I think I worked with significantly in 2020. I'm not somebody who is constantly bringing in new decks and trying to work with them. If anything, I got rid of, I would say, the majority of my collection this year and really tried to hone in on what it was that I liked, why I liked it, and then just work with that and really take it to the next level. So I would say, honestly, if we were to bring in the Thoth and bring out the Thoth and give it a percentage value in terms of decks I work with in 2020, it would probably get a solid 75%, and then the other decks would maybe comprise the other 25%, with this one honestly bordering on at least 5%, even though it was towards the end of 2020. So while those other decks did have a significant role to play in my 2020, they were, for one reason or another, a little bit more fleeting, and then the Thoth was more consistent and throughout the entirety of the year and was being used for client readings, for personal readings, for journaling, for study purposes, and the books that I read, most of those were Thoth related. And then with playing cards, I've been reading a bunch on them too. So yeah, those were the decks that I worked with in 2020. I know that in the decks that I wanted to work with in 2022 that I mentioned that I don't think I really got to this year or did work with were the Elemental Tarot and the Spirit Keepers Tarot by Benabel Wen. And the Elemental Tarot is by, Carolyn, no. I'll put the name somewhere. But I ended up not really jiving so well with the Elemental Tarot, so that's one that's actually leaving my collection. And then the Spirit Keepers Tarot is one that I love very much. I just didn't feel as called to it this year. I still have it and I still intend to use it, and I think it's going to have a reprise within my tarot practice, but I didn't end up picking up where I'd left off with the exercises, and I have read the books on that, but I read the corresponding book of maps and medium white book in 2019, so I think I maybe was a little bit maxed out on the Spirit Keepers Tarot going into 2020, and so I felt more called to give my attention to those other decks that I mentioned. And as 2020 was a strange year, I feel like the decks that I did work with were more out of necessity, so I guess the Spirit Keepers Tarot wasn't one that I felt I needed during this year. So it's interesting to go back and watch that video and see which decks I was sort of felt very called to in a given moment, but that for one reason or another did or didn't enter my life in a significant way. So that brings us to the end. Let me know the decks that you have been working with in 2020. Like and subscribe if this was fun and interesting. I hope you are all well, and until next time, bye.